Welcome back to my 20-year project, and in this episode, I'm going to get started on the rear suspension. Before I dive into it, I do need to clean up the rear axle. And in episode 4, I had said this. So give a lot of room too to even work on the rear end because I'm going to be changing the mounts here too, so I'm going to have to cut away these mounts. In all transparency, when I had the frame cut off, I did clean up the rear axle. So I'll now take you through the steps I took. Since the new 4-link design I have will move everything, I need to remove the existing tabs that are on the axle. I do keep the inboard lower links since they may still work with the design that I have in mind. I have some cutting and grinding marks on the axle tubes from the last time I did this type of cleanup, so I'll be adding some welds to fix those. More on that later. What is crazy is that this will be the 4th air ride suspension design on this truck, and for sure this will be the last. As you can see, I'm using the plasma cutter to roughly cut off the tabs. I then use a cutoff wheel to take off more material. I do this part a bit slower, and with the axle tube being round, I've come up with this process where I cut horizontally as close as I can to the tube, and then do a vertical cut to break it down into smaller pieces. It's just a matter of repeating this process. Once that is done, things move a lot faster. I use a flap disc to further smooth down the remnants of the tabs, and then I use a wire wheel on the whole tube to better see the high and low spots. With that done, I start to mark off the imperfections that I will address. For the high spots, I use an 80 grit 3-inch Rolock disc with an ankle die grinder. For the low spots, I add some tack welds to fill them in. Once that's done, I sand those down first with the flap disc and then the ankle die grinder. Lastly, I go over the entire axle tubes with a DA sander that has a 120 grit disc on it. It isn't perfect, but it's way better than what I started with. At one point, I was thinking about building a bridge across the axle tubes, so I had something I could weld the upper 4-link bars to. And knowing it'd be hard to clean in this area once that's done, I spent some time cleaning it now. And here are the tools I used to accomplish it. Now that I have the axle cleaned up, I need some parts to start building the rear suspension. I drove a bunch of parts for the axle side of the rear suspension in Fusion 360, and the first part that I'll walk you through is the lower bag mount. This is a 5.5-inch diameter circle and a setup for 3 bolts. The center bolt may or may not be used. It all depends on if I can actually get a bolt when it's connected to the axle. The other 2 bolt holes are kidney shaped, and that's to allow some rotation of the bag just to make it easier for alignment with the upper bag mount. These kidney holes are probably a little bit too big, but I would rather have more flexibility for adjustment than less. You also see these 2 slots. They're going to be used to help locate the piece that will connect this mount to the axle. I'm actually more excited about this design than I should be, and I'll explain why in a minute. This is the piece that will connect that lower bag mount to the axle. I have 2 on each side. You can see here there's a tab, and this is what's going to be used to locate this in the slot on the mount itself. When assembled, the lower bag mount is going to look like this. You'll notice that the tab doesn't stick all the way through the slot. This is part of my design and will allow me to get some weld on the top. When you do a fillet weld, which I'll have on the outside and on the inside of this part, you have an inherent crack. Having this groove will give me a spot that I can weld and maximize penetration in that area. This is what I'm really excited about, since the slot and tab will not only act as a locator, but also a spot to add more weld. This is my design for the upper bag mount, and it's not a full circle, and this is because some of this over here is going to be mounted underneath the frame. I have slots for the upper bag bolts as well as a slot for the airline fitting. Since I actually have the bags on hand and a fitting itself, I made sure that this slot is big enough for the fitting itself. So if I need to remove the airbag for any reason, all I need to do is disconnect the airline, undo the bolts, and then I'll be able to pop out the airbag with the fitting in place. You also see there's some notches here, and this is going to help locate the gussets, which I will show you next. Here's the gusset. It's a fairly simple design. It is on the small side, and this bottom area here is only 1.5 inches, and that's because it's the only room that I have from the frame, which will be on the back side here, to where the upper bag mount starts to curve. Assembled, the part looks like this. So What I don't have here is the frame itself, which will sit in this area here. And then I have two gussets, one on each side with a tab slot location, so I can make sure it's in the right spot. The notch here is a bit short, and you can see that the gusset hangs over a little bit. And that was me balancing between being able to do a proper corner joint where the pieces are edge on edge and having some way to locate the pieces together. So it will be a bit of a mixed corner joint and a fillet joint. So this is the lower bar mount on the axle end. So I used one of the tabs that I cut off and traced it. So then I could figure out what the angle between these edges are, the distance between the hole and the edge, and knowing that the distance here at where it mounts to the axle to the center of the hole is 3.5 inches, I was able to draw up the rest. So nothing really special here. I just needed two more of the ones that I already have on the axle. So after finishing the design in Fusion 360, I want to make sure that the parts will fit before I get them sent off to be cut in metal. So I printed off on one-to-one the upper bag mount, the lower bag mount, as well as the lower bar link. And with it cut out, I can now put it onto the actual bag and see that the bolt holes line up. I have lots of room, and same with the air fitting. On the bottom side, it's similar. You can see the 3 holes and lots of room for rotation. Lastly, for the lower link tab, I took that part and made it into a cardboard template, so then I can test it on the axle tube itself to make sure that it'll fit. I now need these parts to be cut in metal, so I sent my drawings to Send Cut Send. It's my first time using this service, and things turned out well. And here's the lower bag mount, and from a finishing perspective, this is the first time I ever had parts cut out with a laser, so I wasn't sure what to expect, and there's a little bit of kind of material here, so I have to do a little bit of cleanup, but it's not bad. Way easier than doing this by hand, so I don't mind a little bit of grinding down, kind of, I guess, the areas where the laser start and stopped. The tabs that I made worked out really well. They fit in snug and give a spot for it to locate as well once I turn it over, and you can see the groove that I wanted in the design, which I can just weld up. It fits well on the airbag, and it fits well on the axle tube. Here's the upper bag mount, and it fits well. The holes are fairly well centered, including the airline fitting. And I have the little gussets, again with the little tab, just to help from a location perspective. It won't necessarily stand on its own, but with a square magnet, I can hold it up while I tack weld it. And here's the lower bar link, and you can see when I compare it on either side using the cardboard template I made, the fit is exact. Now that I have the first pieces to build the 4-link suspension, I'm itching to get them tacked into place. I start with the upper bag mounts, and the first thing I do is sand the surface with 60 grit to remove any burrs from the laser cutting and just to clean up that surface. I then mark and clean up the frame where it'll be mounted. I mark the center of the bag mount, and using a laser, I make sure that the center mark aligns with the center of the axle hump. Then I clamp it into place. I add a few tacks to the mount and the gussets, so it'll be held into place while I continue my mock-up. Before I can tack anything to the axle, I need to make sure that the pinion angle is set. I designed a piece with a flat that I can attach a magnetic level to and had a friend machine it. This will also help me measure the length of the drive shaft. The problem with my design is that it can rotate, so I make sure that it is level with the yoke and use a laser level to ensure that the angle finder is vertical. I'm looking for 3 degrees from 90, so my target is 87 degrees. This is how I've set up to weld in the lower 4-link bracket here, or tab. First thing I did is I bolted everything together. So this part's already welded, so it's got a fixed spot. And then with the bar and then this bracket, and I did a quick check, make sure that it was square with the axle, which it is. Then I need to make sure that I can have this parallel. So over here, I measured from the outside of the tube to the outside of the frame, and I'm at 4 1/8 inches. And then I use the laser level to do the same over here because there's no frame in this spot. So using that, it's maybe a hair over, but I think it's going to be good enough for what I need to do. So next up, I'm going to tack in this tab. With the lower four-link bars in place at the axle end, I now have to figure out how I'm going to connect it to the frame on the forward end. The first thing I need to do is remove this temporary cross member because it is holding this bar from going down, and my plan is to have both lower bars, well, they should be both, but I want them to be at 0 degrees, so parallel with the ground when it's at ride height. Now with the crossbar removed, I found another problem. I'm not quite at 0, and it's because I'm hanging up on this cross member here. On the other side, I'm fine. I have enough room. It's actually a little low. I just got to shim it up a bit. But here, I need to go down, and I am running into interference. If it was just the bolts, maybe I could get around it, but the bushing is sitting on this. So I gotta figure out what I'm gonna do there. My plan is to use the temporary cross member that I put in between the forward bed mounts and attach them to the frame. I used some 1x1 from a previous cross member and set it next to the frame to figure out the angle I need to cut. I cut out the pieces I need, place them where I want them, then tack them in. Once supported, I could cut away the piece that was interfering with that lower bar. I want to take some time for you to get in my head and understand my trail of thought. This temporary cross member is important because it's holding where the front of the bed mounts are. So, and they're just in space on this side and that side. I still need to figure out how I'm going to connect that to the frame, and it's also close to where the four-link bars are going to go. So you can see the bottom one, which is in position, and then the upper one, I'm planning to be around this area as well. So I think by tying everything in, and then I will have to have a permanent cross member that's going to go across. Also, why it's important, if you've seen some of my previous videos, this is my datum point, my point that I was measuring everything off of, especially from here to where the center of the axle is. That way it's centered in the wheel wells of the bed. So what I am planning on doing is first figuring out this lower mount. And I think I wanna kind of have something here where the tabs move forward. That gives me lots of room for it to articulate up and down without it hitting anything. And then here I can maybe somehow triangulate it this way. And then when the next piece I'm going to do is figure out how I mount this permanently, that down to the frame, and how I tie those two together. And lastly, I'll figure out the upper links, but I still have to decide how I'm going to connect that to the axle. This is how I go about designing a custom part. The first thing I do is a lot of staring. Then I start to get distracted thinking about other parts I need to design. Next, I do some sketches to get that idea from my head onto paper. Now comes the measuring, which I always measure multiple times to make sure I have it right. I use these measurements to finalize my sketches and remeasure because you didn't set the bar length correctly. Now that I have the right measurements, I draw it up in Fusion 360, print off the design and transfer it to cardboard. Lastly, I do a test fit before I get it ready to be cut into metal. Looking at the cardboard version of the part, there's a couple things. One is another cross member is getting in my way, so I gotta cut that one off so I can move this back into position. And secondly, I think there's a way I could tie this to be one piece that holds the 4-link brackets or tabs that will go all the way up for the bed mount. So I'm going to come up with a design to see if I can incorporate both together. So here's my redesign. As you can see, I've extended the piece to go up and it will meet the bed mount over here. And then I also have another support on the back side, which goes from the bed mount all the way down to the frame rail. And I've incorporated a tab and slot design so that I can locate the 3 pieces together. You'll also notice that I've included this little thin slot there, and that's because as I rotate the piece, you'll see there's a gap. And that gap is because the bed mount is 2.5 inches wide, but down here it's 3 inches. So either side needs to bend in a 1/4 of an inch, and that slot will just give it a little bit of a relief to make it a little bit easier for me to make that bend. So once it's on the frame rail, I can clamp them together, tack it to the bed mount, and then once that's all done, I can just weld up that slot. So here's where I'm at. As you saw, I have the new design to connect the lower link to the frame rail to the bed mount. And next up, I want to work on the upper bars, which will start off back here and end somewhere in this area. But it's a lot of space and there's not much reference points until I get this bracket that I came up with. So next stop is I need to order those pieces, get them cut out and at least tacked in. So then I have some sort of reference, some sort of base that I could build from. I also don't have the link bars themselves, so I have to order those. I have an idea of what the length's going to be, but having this area and maybe a mock-up of what the bracket's going to look like for the upper mounts will let me confirm that I will be ordering the right length. And lastly, this is temporary. And if I keep this as is, the drive shaft's going to hit it. So I need to connect the driver's side and the passenger side together, but I also need to go over the drive shaft. So I might also be in a spot now to order the drive shaft. The one that I have that came with the transmission is too short, and the one that came with the truck originally doesn't have the right spline, so I just need to get a brand new drive shaft. So I'm thinking I have to do some shopping. So bracket, drive shaft, figure out what the bracket's going to look like for the upper links. So then I could figure out and confirm the lengths for the upper links and then bring it together. So I'm getting things off here. I really hope you enjoyed the video. It's going to take me a few of them before I get the whole rear suspension figured out. And sneak peek, you can see an airbag behind me. So I'm starting to mock things up to figure out the placement. And if you did enjoy this video, please like, please subscribe. It will really help me out. I'll see you next time.